I want to start by introducing our very esteemed keynote speaker. Richard Armstrong has been in the direct mail business since 1971 when he got a job as the chief stamp licker and envelope stuffer at the Republican National Committee. His first assignment was rolling up giant life-size pictures of Richard Nixon and putting them into cardboard mailing tubes. It was a dirty job, said Richard, but somebody had to do it. Over the next 43 years, Richard has worked for nearly every major direct mail organization in the United States, both nonprofit and for-profit. Among his past and present clients are many names you'll recognize: Boardroom, Agora, Rodale, Phillips, Kiplinger's, Greenpeace, Reader's Digest, Time Inc., Smithsonian, National Review, ASPCA, Newsweek, even AWAI. Along the way, he has had some stunning successes. His package for the Sea Turtle Rescue Fund won Best in Show at the Caples Awards and sparked a feature-length profile of Richard in Advertising Age. His package promoting the sugar solution was one of the biggest hits in the history of prevention health books. He launched the magazine Women's Health for Rodale and also Rodale's magazine for older men called Best Life. And speaking of launches, Richard also wrote the launch package for the Limbaugh Letter, which quickly became one of the most widely circulated newsletters in the United States. Many of Richard's direct mail packages have set records for longevity. His Crazy Rich Aunt letter on behalf of Kiplinger's personal finance magazine mailed for 12 years. His membership package for the Good Sam Club mailed for over a decade. And his best-kept secret package for Practical Sailor magazine has mailed for more than 13 years. Perhaps that's why Gary Bencivenga once described Richard as one of the best direct mail copywriters on the planet. William F. Buckley, Jr. called his writing terrific. And when a reporter asked the late, great Bill Jamie who his favorite copywriter was, he said Richard Armstrong. Richard is the author of the only book on political direct mail, The Next Hurrah, and the world's only novel about direct mail, God Doesn't Shoot Craps. His digital portfolio of direct mail samples, which he calls My First 40 Years in Junk Mail, has been downloaded by more than 5,000 people around the world. In that sample book, Richard recounts a career in which he has done just about every kind of commercial writing available: speech writing, publicity writing, the writing of brochures, flyers, and annual reports, even television. He wrote an infomercial for Boardroom's Book of Inside Information and co-starred in it with the legendary television announcer Hugh Downs. The only medium I haven't written for is radio, said Richard, and that's because I can't say hello in less than 500 words. But he promises to keep his speech tonight under an hour, although I don't think any of us will be looking at our watches. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our keynote speaker, Richard Armstrong.
I'm the only 62-year-old person in the country with his own sippy cup. Thank you so much, Katie, and thanks to all of you for inviting me here tonight. I cannot tell you what a great honor it is for me to be asked to give the keynote speech at the AWAI Bootcamp, especially when you consider all of the amazing speakers that you're going to be hearing from this week. In fact, when I looked at the list of the speakers you're going to be hearing from, I actually looked up the word keynote in the dictionary just to make sure it didn't mean the least important. But I found something interesting in the dictionary. Keynote is one of those words that we've been using metaphorically for so long that we've actually forgotten that it has a literal meaning. But if you've ever sung in a choir, you know the meaning of keynote very well. The keynote is what's played on a pitch pipe to make sure that everybody in the choir starts off on the same key and on the same note. And that's appropriate because we're going to be talking tonight a lot about sound, about how we communicate with each other, and about how important it is that we're singing in the same key with our customers. Before I get to that, though, let me say again really how excited I am to be here. I love AWAI. I buy all their products. I subscribe to their magazine. I bought their health copywriting course. I bought their financial copywriting course. And I bought the Bootcamp videos on those occasions when I couldn't be here in person or when I wasn't invited. And I keep asking Katie if I can get all this stuff for free, because after all, I've been a speaker here before, and I've written some of their promotions for them, and I kind of see myself, you know, as part of the AWAI family. And Katie always says to me, forget about it, Richard, you got to pay just like everybody else. She did say, however, that I could stay here for the rest of this week and attend all of these sessions for free, so believe me, I am going to do that, because the lineup of great copywriters and industry leaders and up-and-coming superstars of tomorrow that you have here this week is so impressive. I mean, I actually thought about bringing an autograph book with me. Here's a partial list. John Carlton, Bob Bly, Clayton Makepeace, G. Rubio, Carlene Anglade Cole, Herschel Gordon Lewis, Donna Bear Stein, Brian Kurtz, John Ford, Joshua Boswell, Will Newman, Pam Foster, Ed Gandia, Sean McCool, Heather Robson, Charlotte Crockett, Jen Stevens, Steve Slonwhite, Marcella Allison, Mindy McHorse, Nick Osborne, Lori Haller, Dan Kennedy. Holy moly. I mean, I think we can quote that other famous Kennedy by saying this is probably the greatest collection of copywriting geniuses ever assembled in one room since David Ogilvy dined alone. So that's why I'll be here for the rest of the boot camp, so that I can soak up all of this great information and advice and, you know, not have to pay for it. So if you see me hanging around in the hallway, please come up and say hello. If you have any questions about copywriting or about, you know, running a freelance business, I will be more than happy to try to answer them. As people say, as Katie said a few minutes ago, there's no such thing as a stupid question. There are, however, a few exceptions. My wife and I took a trip up to Gettysburg last year for our wedding anniversary. Kind of a strange place to go to for your wedding anniversary, don't you think? The site of a major Civil War battle. May say something about our marriage, I don't know. But my wife has been getting into genealogy recently, and she has a great-great-great-grandfather from North Carolina, or had a great-great-grandfather from North Carolina, who fought at Gettysburg, and she kind of wanted to retrace his footsteps during the battle. He was actually one of the few Confederate soldiers to survive Pickett's charge. Now, personally, I think he survived by charging in the wrong direction. General Pickett said, "Charge," and my wife's great-great-grandfather said, "Well, I reckon it's about time to be getting back to Carolina." I took this picture from the back here so that you could kind of view the scene from the Union Army's point of view. No, I'm just teasing my wife. She's here tonight, by the way. Sharon, raise your hand so everybody can see you. I'm sure her ancestor fought very, very bravely. I certainly know she fights very bravely. Is she laughing? Anyway, after a while, the tour guide played us kind of a nice compliment. He said, "You know, you folks seem to have a pretty good idea of what was going on during the battle. I can tell because you're asking good questions." And I said, "Well, you know, doesn't everybody?" And he said, "No. He said, "Matter of fact, we had a group up here a couple years ago. Guy says to me, 'Well, I don't understand why they didn't just hide behind these monuments and shoot from back there like this.'" He said, "When you hear a question like that, you know you got to dumb it down just a little bit. You got to gear your message to your audience, if you know what I mean." Well, I knew exactly what he meant because that's pretty much the topic of my speech tonight. It reminded me actually of a story that Jeff Foxworthy likes to tell, you know, the redneck comedian. He took all of his relatives on a big trip to Hollywood, and he showed them all the sights, you know, the Hollywood Bowl and the Hollywood sign and Universal Studios and all that stuff. But when he got to the La Brea tar pits, he could tell that one of his cousins was kind of confused, you know, and he said, so what's the matter, Billy Bob? And Billy Bob said, well, frankly, I'm surprised that the dinosaurs would venture this close to the downtown area. Some people just have trouble grasping the changes that take place in time and space. And that's another topic that we're going to be talking about tonight. Speaking of changes in time and space, I actually wish that I could exchange places with you tonight. And that's not just because I love to hear myself speak, although that's part of it. It's really because I envy you for getting into this business at exactly the right time in history to achieve a level of wealth and power and influence rarely attained by copywriters in the past. In fact, if I had brought an autograph book with me, the prudent thing to do would be to have each and every one of you sign it, because I have a very strong feeling that the copywriting superstars of tomorrow are sitting right in front of me tonight. And when you look at the history of advertising, there's never been a time when the opportunities for copywriters were greater. There's never been more different media to work in. There's never been more good clients who are committed to the idea of hiring good copywriters. And frankly, just between you and me, there's never been more money available for copywriters in terms of, royalties and bonuses and incentive compensations of one kind or another. That kind of stuff was sort of rare when I was getting started many years ago, much more common nowadays. But you have an important decision to make. Will you become just another ordinary copywriter, or will you become an extraordinary copywriter? And that is probably the most important thing that I want to discuss with you tonight. But first, I want to give you a little short course in the history of advertising to show you exactly where you fit in to this dramatic story. Advertising is salesmanship in print, the great copywriter John E. Kennedy said. And he was right. All advertising traces its roots back to the door-to-door peddler who traveled the back roads of America, carried his wares in a suitcase or a kit bag, and he always dealt with his customers on a face-to-face basis, on a person-to-person basis. But gradually, the country and the economy got too big for every product to be sold face-to-face. And before long, a giant network of wholesalers and retailers and distributors took the place of the door-to-door salesman. Suddenly, there were layers upon layers of middlemen, a brand new word, who stood between the buyer and the seller. And to overcome this obstacle, sellers turned to a new way of talking to buyers, the mass media. Newspapers, national magazines, direct mail, radio, eventually television, became the place where salesmanship happened and where it came to be known as advertising. And this is where we first saw a great divide begin to take place between two different schools of thought on advertising. On the one hand, you had direct response advertising, which is what AWAI teaches and what the speakers at the Bootcamp practice. The other philosophy is sometimes called general advertising, or Madison Avenue advertising, or brand advertising, or image advertising, or my personal favorite, above-the-line advertising, whatever the hell that means. Frankly, nobody knows what to call it, even as practitioners, especially as practitioners. So let's just call it the crap you see during the timeouts on the Super Bowl. Direct marketing, by contrast, had a very humble beginning. In fact, much of it can be traced back to a single individual. He was one of the world's first great direct mail copywriters, and you know, like so many of the world's great direct mail copywriters, his first name was Richard. Richard was a train station manager. One day, he got a delivery of pocket watches that arrived COD, but nobody showed up to claim them, so he decided to buy them himself. You see, he had a list of all the other station managers and the conductors along his railroad line, and he knew that they were always in need of a good pocket watch. I mean, this was back in the days of single tracking, and a good pocket watch is often what made the difference between an on-time arrival and a head-on collision. He wrote his coworkers a letter offering to sell them these watches at a fair price. He made a nice profit. Before long, he started selling other things to his list by mail. And as that product line grew, those little handwritten letters eventually became mail order catalogs, and rather big mail order catalogs. And before long, he was able to move his little business out of the tiny train station and into this somewhat larger building that you see here. Yes, Richard Sears was the father of modern direct marketing. And to this day, we still use many of the techniques that he pioneered. The free trial offer, the money-back guarantee, split testing. You know, I probably type the words "send no money" about a dozen times a day, and Richard Sears was the first person to come up with that line. Meanwhile, back on Madison Avenue, they were developing different techniques and a very different philosophy about how to advertise. Their theory was that advertising should plant a seed in the customer's mind, and that seed should bloom or maybe explode when the customer gets to the store. It wasn't such a bad idea, especially when you consider that they were usually selling things that couldn't be sold as well by mail, things like soap or cereal or even automobiles. But they had a big problem. Their kind of advertising was not measurable. The great department store tycoon John Wanamaker once very famously said, "You know, I know that half of my advertising is wasted, but I have to keep doing it because I don't know which half." His figures were a little off. As every direct marketer in this room knows, about 98% of all advertising is wasted. But general advertisers have to keep doing it because they don't know which 98%. We do. We know because we get those little reply cards back. And that precious 1 or 2% who respond, they make all the difference in the world. That 2% is the reason why direct marketers tend to think of advertising as a science, and why general advertisers tend to think of it as some weird kind of postmodern performance art. Now, that's not to say that Madison Avenue doesn't try to measure results, because they do. They conduct a lot of opinion polls and focus groups and surveys and so forth. When Sharon and I first moved to New York City, I had to take a job in a market research firm just to pay the rent. Or help pay the rent. Sharon certainly paid her half of it. And I would call up consumers at random, and I would ask them questions like this. Do you think Goodyear makes a friendly, likable sort of tire? Compared to Michelin tires, would you say Goodyear tires are more friendly, less friendly, or about the same? I did that for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. So don't ever tell me I haven't paid my dues in the advertising. But you know, you really have to feel sorry for the Madison Avenue agencies, because with no way of measuring results, they have no way of telling who's doing good work and who isn't. So the advertising award has become like the holy grail of Madison Avenue. There's so many award ceremonies on Madison Avenue nowadays, it's like everybody wins a trophy day at summer camp. Which would be funny if it weren't for the fact that this has a terrible effect on the quality of the work itself. Because what goes into the winning of an award is rarely, if ever, the same as what goes into the making of an effective ad. Nowadays, we have a culture of creativity on Madison Avenue that puts a premium on humor, on entertainment, and on originality instead of sales. Which is why you cannot turn your television set on nowadays without seeing a reptile trying to sell you car insurance. But that lizard gives us great name recognition, say the folks at Geico. To which I would reply, I hope so. because you spend nearly $1 billion a year on advertising. I'm not kidding, $1 billion with a B. I mean, imagine how much car insurance you'd sell if you spent $1 billion on direct mail written by Clayton Makepeace. Every man, woman, and child in the universe would have Geico insurance. Speaking of the universe, let me take you back into history to show you the essence of how advertising works. Back before Richard Sears, before the door-to-door peddler, further back even than the invention of currency, trade, marketplaces, agriculture, even civilization itself. In fact, let's start at the very beginning. No, let's go even further back than that. There. Some of you may recall that there was quite a fuss in the world of physics a few years ago when scientists in Switzerland discovered something they called the Higgs boson. Now, what was interesting about this was not the boson itself, which is just one of dozens or maybe even hundreds of subatomic particles. What was interesting was that it proved the existence of something called the Higgs field. The Higgs field is an ocean of energy that extends infinitely in all directions. And as waves and currents in this ocean of energy gradually slow down into whirlpools and eddies and backwaters, particles of mass are formed. You and I are not only made of the same stuff, in other words, we're really just different ripples in the same ocean of energy. Something very similar can be said about the universe of information, part of which includes advertising messages. You know, it's become very fashionable in speeches like this to say that we are bombarded with information and that the advertiser's main job is to break through with his message. But this cliche shows a very poor understanding of what's really going on in the world of communication today. Nowadays, it makes no more sense to say that we are bombarded with information than it would be to say that a fish is bombarded with water. No, a fish is swimming in water. He's living in water. He's breathing water. To a very large extent, he's actually made of water. And so it is with human beings and information. We're no longer bombarded with information. We're swimming in it. We're living in it. We're breathing it. We're actually made of it. You might say that we're living in the midst of an infinite information field, and that messages are conveyed in this field by means of waves. Like ripples on a pond, sound is transmitted by waves. Light moves through space in waves. And of course, radio and television signals are transmitted via electromagnetic waves. If you want to find the secret of the universe, said Nikola Tesla, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So the goal of good ad nowadays is no longer to break through by increasing the number or the power of our bombardments. The goal is to resonate with the information in the customer's mind by fine-tuning the wavelength of our message. We're no longer trying to break through to our customers, in other words. We're trying to tune into them. Speaking of tuning, you might remember this little experiment from your high school physics. I talked about it the last time I was down here. It's called sympathetic tuning forks. It consists of two tuning forks which have been set to the exact same frequency and wavelength. You know, I used to bring these tuning forks with me when I made speeches like this, but ever since 9/11, I can't seem to get past security without getting waterboarded, you know. So if you haven't seen this experiment before, you're just going to have to bear with me and take my word for it. But when you strike the tuning fork on the left, obviously you're going to hear a tone. Now you can make that fork stop vibrating by touching it with your fingers, but that's when you'll notice you're still hearing the tone. And suddenly you realize the other tuning fork is vibrating even though you never touched it. How many of you remember that from high school physics or college physics? Great. You know, I asked my wife that question. She went to Catholic school, and I asked her if she remembered this experiment. And she said, you know, no, but we had something very similar. She said, when the nun hit one kid with a ruler, all the other kids would flinch. Here's the point I'm trying to make. The first fork didn't persuade the other fork to vibrate. It didn't convince the other fork to vibrate. It didn't argue or threaten or cajole the other fork into vibrating. It simply sent out a message that was on the exact same frequency and wavelength as the other fork, and that stimulated the other fork into vibrating. The point of advertising is not to fill up your customer's mind with new facts and figures and beliefs, opinions, dreams, desires. It's to take the facts, figures, beliefs, opinions, dreams, and desires that are already inside his head and resonate with them in such a way that they trigger a response. Think how often we refer to this in common speech. We often say, for example, well, that really struck the responsive chord, or that idea really resonated with me, or even something simple like I get a good vibe from that person. And we're not thinking about physics experiments when we say these things, but we're recognizing the essential truth of this idea. Speaking of the responsive chord, let me give credit where credit is due. That is the name of a book by Tony Schwartz, which is the best book about copywriting you probably never read. And the reason you probably haven't read it is because it's not about copywriting. It's about communication in general, but it's still an amazing book. Tony Schwartz was no relation to Gene Schwartz, who you probably have heard of, the author of Great Breakthrough Advertising, and you know, they probably didn't even know each other. But I knew them both a little bit, and together these two men, and especially these two books, really shaped the way I think about writing copy today. That's why the first thing I always think about when I sit down to write copy is, what does my customer already believe? What is he already thinking about? What information does he already have in his head that will resonate with the product that I'm trying to sell? Because you can't change people's beliefs in advertising for the most part. You can only channel their beliefs in such a way that they trigger a response. That's why I believe that the old model of advertising and communication is dead. You see, here's the way we used to look at advertising and communication. Advertiser A sends message M through time and space to reach customer C. Then he sits back and waits. Sometimes he waits a long time. Eventually, customer C makes purchase P from advertiser A. That's the way we used to look at it. That's the way we looked at it for at least a century or more. Here's the way I think we should be looking at it nowadays. In this new model, both advertiser A and customer C are constantly exchanging and transmitting information with each other. And the goal is to trigger R, which can stand for resonance, or it can stand for response. In many cases nowadays, we're just looking for a response, an expression of interest, not necessarily a purchase. Because advertising has gotten so cheap nowadays that we no longer have to score a direct hit with our first shot. We can kind of refine our aim over the course of dozens or even hundreds of emails before we finally get a purchase. It's kind of like ranging in a cannon on the battlefield. Speaking of battles, look at what happens to time and space in this new model of communication. Sending a message and getting a reply used to take days or weeks or even months. In the War of 1812, for example, the Battle of New Orleans actually took place after the war had ended. The treaty between America and England was signed in Belgium in December of 1815, but the news didn't reach America until a month later in 1816. And as a result, thousands of soldiers died needlessly on the battlefield in New Orleans. Nowadays, communication happens instantly, happens too fast in many cases. I no longer believe that World War III will start when somebody accidentally pushes the nuclear button. I believe it'll start when somebody accidentally pushes reply all. And This collapse of time and space contributes to the fact that we are now living in the information field, where communication is no longer something we do, it's something we are. Let me give you two quick examples of what I'm talking about. First, let me show you a photo. Just take a look at that photo and just think of the first thing that pops in your mind. Now, if you're like most people, probably the first thing you thought was pollution. But if I'd shown that same photo, that exact same photo, to a group of copywriters 100 years ago, they wouldn't have thought pollution at all. They would have thought, ooh, prosperity. Okay? Isn't that interesting? The picture didn't change. The audience did. And not so much the audience itself, but the kind of information and beliefs and opinions that are stored inside their heads. Or what if I told you that I had a teacher in high school who, sadly, he had a stroke and he was out for a couple months, and when he came back, he had trouble grasping a piece of chalk. So when he wrote something on the blackboard, the chalk would screech and squeal, and sometimes he would actually drop the chalk and his fingernails would scrape across the blackboard. How many of you just tried to protect your teeth like that? Probably some tried to dig your fingernails into your palms of your hand, too. I used to do both of those things. That is the power of resonance. I can trigger a specific response out of you with a photo or a story because I know that you have certain attitudes or experiences in your mind that I happen to share with you. Now, of course, these are just parlor tricks compared to the process of writing copy, in which you're trying to trigger memory after memory, belief after belief, emotion after emotion, in a systematic way that results in a sale. Writing an ad is kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, where the finished puzzle is a purchase, and each of the jigsaw pieces is a dream, a wish, a desire, an opinion, a fear, or a belief that's rattling around inside your customer's head. Before you can make the puzzle look like the photo on the box, you've got to dump out all the jigsaw pieces and gradually figure out which one goes where. It's it's no wonder that Gene Schwartz was very fond of saying that great copy is not written, it's assembled. Gene Schwartz also said this. Probably, if you only read one part of breakthrough advertising, this is probably the most important thing. Writing copy is like playing the stock market or being an atomic physicist, because all three of these professions deal with gargantuan natural forces thousands of times more powerful than the men who use them. In science, they are the fundamental energies of the universe. In finance, they are the billion-dollar tides and currents of the stock market. And in copywriting, they are the hopes and fears and desires of millions upon millions of men and women all over the world. And the greatest desire in the world today, in my opinion, is the desire for self-expression. We no longer live in a society where most people are starved for food or clothing or shelter, thank God. But we do live in a society where most people are starved for recognition. Actors, singers, movie directors are lucky because they have these wonderful ways to express themselves in their work. But most of us aren't so lucky. We can't sing, we can't act. Most of us can't even play the harmonica. But the one thing we can do, and we do it very well, is buy stuff. And we want that stuff to say something about who we are. That's why one of the most important questions you can ask yourself when you write copy is, what is my customer trying to say about himself when he buys my product? Why do people buy Grey Goose vodka, for example? I mean, vodka is supposed to be an odorless, colorless, tasteless alcohol made from fermented potatoes. It's very hard to make any vodka that tastes any different from any other vodka. And yet every day, thousands of guys belly up to the bar and they say, I'll have a Grey Goose martini straight up, extra dry with a twist. Now, why do they do that? Do you think it's because they can actually tell that Grey Goose is made from wheat rather than potatoes? Not after the first one, they can't. No, they do it because Grey Goose costs $70 a bottle, and a martini made with it costs much more than a regular martini, so they're basically walking up to the bar and saying, hi, I'm a wealthy, successful, and sophisticated man to whom money is no object. Or think about this strange fact. This will really knock your socks off. I mean, this surprised me. The Viking range is the Rolls-Royce of gas stoves. Some of them cost more than $4,000. But research shows that up to 75% of Viking ranges are never used. I didn't say rarely used or seldom used. I said never used. So obviously, people are buying Viking ranges for some reason other than heating up their hot pockets. They're saying something about themselves. It fits with their personal story. But don't make this mistake. This is not just a matter of status or keeping up with the Joneses. I mean, after all, how many people are ever going to see your Viking range? You know, just your family and maybe a handful of friends who probably already know that you're stinking rich. And the guy who drinks Grey Goose at the bar, well, he doesn't suddenly switch to Smirnoff when he gets home. So it's not just the story they're trying to tell other people, it's the story they're trying to tell themselves. With all due apologies to Walt Whitman, I call this the song of myself, or the barbaric yawp. If you listen carefully, your customer is constantly singing his song of sorrow and suffering, and most importantly, self-involvement. We all do this. We do it all the time. We just don't do it out loud. We walk down the street having an angry, intense, frequently delusional conversation with ourselves about the past, about the future, about, woulda, coulda, shoulda. We're driving it home at night thinking, oh, God, I'm so sick of this commute. I should have told my boss to go to hell today. I wish I could find some way to work at home, get out of the rat race. I wish I could work for myself and still make a good income. Wait, I know what I'll do. I'll go to the AWAI Bootcamp. Sound familiar? I know how this works because I wrote one of the promotions that eventually brought some of you here tonight. And I did it by entering the conversation that was going on inside your head. Now, that is a piece of copywriting advice that I'm sure you've heard thousands of times before, even if you're relatively new to the business. But how exactly do you do it? That's the question. My friend Denny Hatch likes to tell a story about a colleague of his who was in the business of selling those little booklets that you see for sale on the newsstand at supermarkets. And the best-selling booklet that this guy ever published had just 2 words on the cover, just 2, but that's all it needed. Now, I'll tell you what those 2 words were in a minute, but first let me tell you a little story. A young mother walks into the supermarket, and she's worried about her kid because he's still wetting the bed, and he's 46 years old. No, he's 6 years old, but he's still too old to be wetting the bed. Or, when you get to be my age, you could say he's too young to be wetting the bed. And this is on his mother's mind. She's hanging mattresses out to dry every day. She's worried that maybe her kid has mental problems or maybe kidney problems. And she's thinking, what should I do? Should I take him to the doctor? Should I take him to a shrink? Maybe he's getting bullied at school. Maybe I should talk to his teacher. I want to be a good mother. Well, gosh, I am a good mother. It's not my fault this is happening, but it's up to me to do something about it. And all this is going on in her head as she walks through the grocery store. She's probably just going through the motions of shopping. She's maybe reading from a grocery list. She's not thinking about what she's buying. And she's definitely not thinking about all the advertising messages that are coming your way, the special sales, the coupons, the announcements over the loudspeaker, all of this is just rolling off her like water off a duck's back because it is not part of the conversation in her head. Then finally, she's standing in the checkout line. She's looking at all the magazines and booklets on the newsstand. She's looking at the headlines, but they're not registering with her, even though some of them are very good headlines, like this one, for example. Elizabeth Taylor to marry for the 9th time. Wedding to be held in hell. Remember, Liz married Richard Burton twice, so that's very hard to overlook a headline like that. But she doesn't even notice because it doesn't relate to what she's thinking. And then all of a sudden she sees it. A little booklet that says, wet bed. That's all it says. But she buys it without even bothering to crack it open. Why? Because it struck the responsive chord. That's why. Now, it's important to say that not all of these conversations in our head are about problems that can be easily solved by a booklet in the supermarket. I mean, some of our problems are more existential. One of the most powerful desires we have in life, in my opinion, is just to be somebody. You remember that famous scene in On the Waterfront? Marlon Brando was a boxer who was all washed up because his brother, played by Rod Steiger, was a gangster who used to make Brando lose fights just so that he could win bets. And they're sitting in the back seat of a taxi cab, and Brando sings his song of himself, his barbaric yawp. He says, I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody. And Steiger says, I had some bets laid down for you, kid. You saw some money. But it's never all about money, is it? And what rings so true about that scene, what makes it so touching and so memorable, is that Brando didn't set his sights very high, did he? He didn't say, I could have been champion. He didn't say, I could have been the greatest boxer of all time. He said, I could have been a contender. And that's what so many of us feel today. We don't want to be the greatest person in the world. We just want to be somebody. And if you have a product or an ad that makes people feel like somebody, well, then you have the keys to the kingdom. I mean, some of you are here tonight, for example, because you want to be able to say, I'm a writer, when people ask you what you do for a living. And you know what? That's okay. That's all right. Nothing to be ashamed of there. I like saying I'm a writer, too. It's when they ask me exactly what I write that the conversation seems to take a turn for the worse. But I mean, heck, that's the reason I'm here tonight, because if it were all about money, I'd be back home writing junk mail. That's where the money is. But being the keynote speaker at Bootcamp, well, that makes me feel special. It makes me feel like somebody. I may not be as good a copywriter as Dan Kennedy or John Carlton or Clayton Makepeace, but gosh darn it, I'm a contender. And I'm sure Katie knew that's exactly what I would be thinking when she offered me $25 to speak to you tonight. Being awfully hard on Katie tonight, aren't I? I'll pay for that later. Being kind of hard on my wife, too, I'll really pay for that. Rob Walker, in his book Buying In, said that there are two main ideas that we are trying to express about ourselves when we buy stuff. The first is that we are rugged individuals. And the second is that we are loyal members of a group. Now, those ideas would seem to be contradictory, don't they? But when you stop and think about it, they're really not. I am a big New York Giants fan, for example. Even though I live in Washington, D.C., I am surrounded by Redskins fans. My house, and Sharon will verify this, is filled with Giants iconography. For example, there is my Giants cap, my Giants football, my Eli Manning throw pillow, Notice how Eli is actually throwing on the throw pillow. A little touch of irony there for you. My Giants tissue dispenser. This came in very handy last year when the Giants began their season with 6 straight losses. It's coming in pretty handy this year, too, as a matter of fact. It's my Giants gym bag. Oh, when I bought this gym bag, I said to a friend of mine, a neighbor, I said, hey, now I have a gym bag just like Eli's. And he said, well, yeah, except Eli probably has actual athletic equipment in his, not a box of cheap cigars in a daily racing form. And then finally, there is the pièce de résistance, my Giants bedroom pillowcases. These pillowcases actually show Mickey Mouse playing quarterback for the New York Giants, so I think they're violating 2 different trademarks at the same time. Needless to say, they were made in China. You may laugh, but let me assure you, these pillowcases are a real chick magnet. They always put my wife in the mood. Matter of fact, she was the one who bought them for me. At any rate, when I walk out the door in my Giants cap and my Giants jacket, Redskins fans will honk their horns at me and give me the finger and say, the Giants suck. And this makes me feel like a rugged individualist who bravely goes against the crowd. But every now and then, an enlightened human being will drive by and beep his horn and give me the thumbs up and say, go Giants. And this makes me feel like a proud member of an elite group of intellectuals. So I get both kinds of self-expression with a single hat. But back to that woman with the bedwetting kid. What is she trying to say about herself? Can anyone guess? Anyone knows? Just shout it out. Well, you're way ahead of me. I hope the entire speech has not been lagging behind your thoughts the whole debate. You're absolutely right. She's trying to say that she's a good mother. That's the real reason she's buying the book. Yes, the problem is driving her crazy. When she's wringing out mattresses every day, she'd probably rather be wringing the kid's neck. But she believes that she's a good mother, and that's what she wants to say about herself. Now, she's not buying the booklet to convince other people she's a good mother. She's trying to convince herself she's a good mother. Gene Schwartz once said that a good advertisement is like 3 rivers coming together. There's the river of desire, which in this case is her simple desire to solve the problem. There's the river of self-expression, which is her image of herself as a good mother. And then there is the river of belief, which in this case is her belief that there must be a simple solution to this problem, so simple that you could find it in a $2 supermarket booklet. The point is, all 3 of these rivers already exist in your customer's mind. You don't have to dredge them out yourself. You simply have to put your product in the water and adjust the rudder in such a way that it carries it down all 3 rivers. The only thing you need to remember is that you want to paddle downstream, not up. You want to use what she already desires, use what she already believes, and use what she already wants to say about herself. But the key to making all this work, interestingly enough, is not your ability to write. It's your ability to listen. You need to listen to your customer's song of himself and write your ad in such a way that says, oh, you poor baby, I know exactly how you feel. And I know exactly what you need to do to feel better. You need to buy my product. Of course, when you're listening to your customer, it's very helpful to remember that they often lie. Ask them what they want to see on TV, for example, and they'll always tell you more ballet, opera, and in-depth discussion of foreign policy. What they're really trying to say is they want more sex, violence, and reality TV shows. So remember this rule. Your customer sometimes lies with his mouth, but he always tells the truth with his money. Studying what your customer has purchased in the past is the Rosetta Stone to understanding what he's trying to say about himself, which is why the humble mailing list data card is one of the copywriter's best friends. And it just so happens that we have one of the world's foremost experts on data cards with us this week in Brian Kurtz. So be sure to ask him some questions about those tomorrow when he speaks. Social media is another good listening tool. You know, so far I've been a little skeptical about how good social media is when it comes to outbound direct response advertising. I think the jury is still out on that to some degree, but there is no question in my mind that social media is an excellent way to listen to your customer. Ultimately, you want to use a wide variety of media and a multiplicity of messages back and forth to start a dialogue with your customer that will create an environment where resonance can occur. Because resonance is the power of advertising. It is the force that you've been given to work with. But you have a question to ask yourself. How will you use this force? Will you be Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader? Harry Potter or Lord Voldemort? Will you become just another ordinary copywriter, or will you become an extraordinary copywriter? What makes the difference? Several things. The ordinary copywriter believes that advertising is mostly an art. The extraordinary copywriter believes it's mostly a science. The ordinary copywriter sees himself first as a writer. The extraordinary copywriter sees himself first as a salesman. The ordinary copywriter believes in branding. The extraordinary copywriter believes in benefits. The ordinary copywriter makes his ad entertaining. The extraordinary copywriter makes his ad valuable. And finally, most importantly, the ordinary copywriter uses his power to make money, but the extraordinary copywriter uses it to make a difference. It goes without saying that many, if not most of the people in this room, will go on to make a lot of money with copywriting. You'll be given the tools to do that here at Bootcamp. And you know, your mere presence here tells me that you're the kind of person who will keep on learning, keep honing your skills, keep coming up with wonderful, exciting, profitable new ideas. So yes, a lot of you will use this power to make money. But what really interests me is how you'll use it to change the world and how you'll choose to change it. Because the history of direct marketing is not just the history of great fortunes being made. It's the history of great political movements, of massive cultural shifts, of changing social attitudes and goals. Take this man, for example, Richard Viguerie. After the 1964 election, when Barry Goldwater lost all but 6 states, everybody thought the conservative movement in this country was dead and gone forever. But Richard Viguerie went to the Board of Elections and copied by hand the names and addresses of 12,000 people who had given money to the Goldwater campaign. He began writing them letters and more letters, ultimately millions of letters, until in 1980, he helped elect Ronald Reagan President of the United States, and American politics has never been the same since. Or take this man, Morris Dees, copywriter. This is an amusing story. While he was still in college, an amusing and an inspiring story. He was still in college, Morris Dees started writing letters to the parents of his fellow students. In these letters, he offered to bake a cake and deliver it to their kid on the kid's birthday. By the time he graduated from law school, he was already a very, very wealthy man. He used that money and that law degree, and especially those copywriting skills, to create the Southern Poverty Law Center, a group that fights racism by taking civil rights cases to court on behalf of poor black clients. Or take this man, Ben Franklin. You may know him as one of the fathers of our country, or the face on the $100 bill, but he was actually a direct mail copywriter and mail order entrepreneur. He wrote copy selling his almanac and his potbelly stove. And when he had trouble getting his promotions delivered to prospects, he came up with a unique solution. He created the United States Postal Service. So those of us in this room owe this guy a lot. Or take this man, St. Paul, copywriter. If you think I'm kidding, consider the names of the books that he wrote in the New Testament. St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul's second renewal letter to the Corinthians. He was a direct mail writer. You know, when St. Paul wrote about the resurrection of Jesus, I'm only surprised he didn't say, but wait, there's more. My point is that each of you has an impressive pedigree. You're part of a tradition that goes back as far as civilization itself and includes some of the most important people in history. But I believe our business has an even greater future ahead of it than its past. You have inherited a tremendous power. And during the next few days, you're going to learn how to harness that power. You can use it to enrich your clients and yourself. And by all means, I want you to do so. Why not? Getting rich is nothing to feel guilty about. As Morris Dees proved, personal wealth can be a powerful force for good. But my question for you tonight is this. Will you be a contender? Will you be somebody? Will you use this power you've been given not just to make money, but also to make a difference? And that, my friends, is where my humble speech ends tonight and where your heroic story begins.
Ladies and gentlemen, the extraordinary Richard Armstrong.